So once again, welcome to our Freedom of Speech Forum presented by nowYouth. So hi, I'm Alice. I'm the co-founder, director of internal affairs, the Edmonton chapter president of nowYouth, and I'm going to be running this today. So for those who don't know what nowYouth is or just want to know kind of better what nowYouth is, so we're an international youth organization that seeks to improve the global standing of youth by engaging, educating, and inspiring them to take the next step and change the world for the better. So what we basically do is we work on a youth to youth platform where youth help youth. So where we build genuine connections with youth to make the world a better place, and we strive to inform, connect, and engage with youth on issues that are important to them. So we do this by inspiring and educating people through events such as workshops, retreats, and forums like this. So right now we have 15 branches in 11 countries on 5 continents. And yeah, that's just basically a summary of what we are right now. So what's happening today? Today, our goal is kind of meaningful discussions around 3 topics: social media, minority groups, and should we limit freedom of speech. So we're planning to learn about events around the world regarding the freedom of speech. I hope that you guys are able to take a stance or somewhat kind of know what your stance is on freedom of speech by the end of this, and learn about other people's thoughts and stances on this issue as well. Basically, in total, we're going to have 3 speakers, and after each speaker, we're going to have about a 15-minute breakout room to talk about it, and there's slides about it. So now onto our first segment, which I'm going to be doing, is how do we discuss? So how do we create meaningful discussions, listen to other people's opinions, and be respectful about it? So I'm actually a really avid politics person, debater, high school model United Nations, that kind of person. So that's why I feel like I was most credible to do this, because I do a lot of discussion things, and I kind of know how to generate proper discussion and kind of learn things from discussion. So let's just get into it. So this is kind of what's centered, what this quote kind of shows what the entire forum is about today, is that the aim of an argument or of discussion should not be victory, but progress. So today we're just trying to progress our own views and kind of understand the views of the world better and what's happening in the world better. So that's what the point of today is. So why do we discuss? Why are we even here? Why are you guys even here? So the entire point is that we're trying to understand a subject or topic area more deeply, aka freedom of speech. We're exploring ideas and exchanging information between other youth from all around the world. And we want to expand and clarify our knowledge if we just have a vague sense of what freedom of speech is. So we want to also improve your ability to critically think. Don't just think surface level on the problems, but really think about the impacts and the repercussions and the consequences of things. So we want to improve your language skills, because I know some of you guys are not native English speakers. So since the forum is going to be in English, it'd be really cool for you to practice your English skills. And also increase your confidence in speaking. This discussion is to help perhaps change your attitudes and ideas. If you learn something new and you're like, oh wow, I never thought about this like that. So, and then a discussion in your breakout rooms, maybe your group can have a general consensus, particularly consensus around a viewpoint. And also this gives you a chance to hear the thoughts and ideas of other people and maybe their own experiences about why they really strongly feel about this thing. So how do we discuss? So it's important that you observe, think, and share. So observing means you have to be an active listener, meaning that you're paying attention to what they're saying, that you're not just I don't know, not listening. So it's important that you listen with an open mind and be receptive to new ideas and points of views. You can have your own views, but don't be so stuck in them that if someone doesn't say your view, then they're automatically wrong. So just be open about that and open to people bringing up new perspectives and thoughts on something. I think while the discussion is happening, identify main ideas being said. What is a general sentiment that this person has? Does this person really hate my freedom of speech in minority groups because it really harmed them or something? Or is it yeah, and then evaluate what's being said. and think about how it relates to the theme. Like, is this person talking about something that's like relevant to what we're talking about right now? And like, how relevant is it in our scenario? Like, does it just apply in a specific situation, or should it apply to like a global thing and it makes sense? And like, test your understanding. Like, try and paraphrase what other people are saying, so you kind of know what kind of their thoughts on it. And I think the most important thing here is actually sharing. Like sometimes maybe like you have no idea what you're trying to say, but you're just gonna say something about like the topic, has to be about the topic. But just like unmute yourself and then kind of speak up and share your thoughts. And maybe if you really like have no idea, but like you're interested about someone else's view, maybe just ask questions as well. Be like, what would like would your viewpoint still stand in another situation? So yeah. So like you can, if you don't know what to say, ask them questions. Yeah. So that's basically it. So yeah, that's basically a short little brief overview on how to discuss properly. And then now I believe we're moving on to our first speaker on social media and freedom of speech with Dylan Smith.
Hi everyone, I'm Dylan, and today I'm going to take a look at social media and free speech and the relevant implications of both in today's world. So to begin, each slide, I'm just going to explain how it works. Each slide will look at a case study into this issue from around the world. And at the end of each slide, I might bring up some questions which I hope will stimulate debate during the breakout rooms, and that I hope will be able to sort of muster a kind of a good, healthier discussion. So I'll begin. There we go. So to begin, I'm going to explain the problem. What is the problem? So social media and other similar online information services are at the biggest they have ever been since their creation at the start of the internet age. As with anything, this has come with its own problems. Because social media has become such a big part of our lives and therefore the society we live in, those in control of it have a dangerous power. The power to choose who and what we, as individuals, listen to and who we cannot listen to. The issues that can and have arisen from this range far and wide, but in this presentation we aim to look at something in particular, the problem of censorship and the implications to free speech that the digital age haven't covered. What constitutes a censorship? When should someone's access to these powerful social media platforms be removed? Who should be allowed to handle such power? All these questions have never been more relevant than now, so join us as we explore further into these issues. So first off, I'm going to take a look at something that will appear a lot in this presentation, big tech. Now, if you don't know what big tech is already, it's the term used to describe large global tech corporations. And usually these companies bring in billions of dollars per year. Now, with this vast amount of wealth generated, it is no surprise that there is angst about the power they wield online and how abuse of this power could limit free speech. Now, for one example, just a quick example of how big tech fits into all of this. Recently in Australia, news publishers have been denied use of their news through big tech sites like Facebook and Twitter if they didn't pay quite a large fee. So when the Australian government actually attempted to intervene and correct this misjustice, big tech groups like Facebook decided to deny the citizens news through their sites. Now, this conflict between a democratically elected government and a corporation such as Facebook has raised questions as to how much power single companies should have, and whether, due to how fundamental they are becoming in all of our lives, they should be allowed to block access to basic necessities almost, such as news, the ability to know what's going on in our life. Now I'm going to move on to the case studies around the world, and I hope this is one everyone recognizes. Donald Trump, if there is one example that has made headlines recently in regards to social media and freedom of speech, it is the removal of former US President Donald Trump from Twitter after he encouraged the storming of the Capitol building in January. Now, Twitter banned Mr. Trump from the site after issuing a statement outlining the reasons for the decision, which included the incitement of violence, which thus broke their terms and conditions. Now, following this announcement, questions have been raised, important questions have been raised about how much power Twitter and each of these big tech company CEOs, for example, in this case, Jack Dorsey, can wield, and whether it was suitable for them to have barred such a politically significant figure such as Mr. Trump from their platform, considering how widely used it is. Now, this will lead on to the next few ones. Twitter will reappear in quite a few of these cases because it's very politically motivated, a lot of the things on that site. So if we continue now, this is an example, and instead of a political figure, this is actually two corporate companies fighting over this issue of free speech. So here we have Amazon versus an app called Parler. Now, Parler is a free speech alternative to Twitter, which was actually removed from Amazon's web hosting services after it was accused of harboring posts that incited violence. So this came after both Google and Apple had removed it from their app stores, and it meant that it was basically unable to function normally. No one could use it. It was basically completely dead in the water. So a little bit of background, Parler was known as a heavily right-wing social media platform, specifically after the 2020 US election brought many of Donald Trump's supporters to the app. And some users have seen Amazon's move as equating to censorship of those types of political agenda and views. But once again, the question has been raised as to how much power these big tech companies have, and specifically for Amazon, because they have this massive monopoly on web hosting, and basically lots of the sites that we use rely on it. It means that they do have the ability to just switch those sites off. So should there be more regulation on this? So the next thing I'm going to go is take a look at countries and how they have been dealing with social media and in their relevant sort of states and areas. So here we have Russia, and once again, it's Twitter. So more recently, Twitter has found itself under fire from the Russian media watchdog after they were accused of failing to remove over 3,000 inappropriate posts. Now, some critics of the Russian government believe this to be another attempt to censor opponents of the Kremlin. However, the watchdog has cited content that is not just in the realm of opposition. It has been stuff that definitely should not be kept online, harmful content that nobody wants to see. So but however, it still raises that question of where does the sort of free speech implications of whether or not a country considers anyone's opposition point of view as extremely offensive or anything like that. So laws signed in 2019 had actually given Russian authorities the power to limit access to these social media sites when they deemed the content illegal. But and one example of their use of this power almost was during protests in favor of Putin critic Alexander Navalny. The watchdog warns sites like Twitter to take down posts encouraging the protests or face fines. Now, as I said, unlike previous examples, this is a show of how a country can use their power to limit the use of social media as an outlet for opposition. But it also raises the question of how these things should be related, because social media is so international. We use it all across the country, all across the world, all across all different countries, and yet each one has its own regulations, its own laws, own idea of what's right, what's wrong. So whose jurisdiction should these tech companies actually be under? Now I'll take a look at some of the laws which are being discussed specifically in Europe at this point. We've got one from Poland here, where earlier this year in January, the Polish government has proposed a new bill that would allow them to fine social media companies for failing to reinstate posts they delete if they did not break the Polish laws. And alongside this, they've outlined a plan to introduce something called a Freedom of Speech Council. Now, this council would go line in line with that new law and would be responsible for issuing the orders to restore said deleted content should a user complain. And the council actually find it acceptable now. In order to make sure that it's unbiased and fair in those decisions, they've decided that it should be made up of experts and not politicians to ensure pluralism. Now, the interesting thing about this is, and the sort of freedom of speech implication is, that the bill itself comes from the Justice Minister, who has previously spoken out against certain points of view, such as the LGBTQ rights, and warned against political correctness. So some have seen this move as a way of almost maybe him trying to censor those views which he deems unacceptable. And once again, this raises the question of how bills all across the world like this could be used, and at what point is something deemed acceptable to be restored, and should there be some sort of global definition of what should be allowed on social media, or should it just be up to the individual countries? Once again, here we have another law that's being talked about, this time in the UK, where laws being outlined to give tech companies a duty of care, especially social media companies, a duty of care whereby they will need to deal with they'll need to publish annual reports outlining how they have dealt with content that does not adhere to their terms and conditions. So to make sure that the state-backed regulator Ofcom can keep an eye on them and make sure that what they say they are doing, they are doing. So they're definitely getting rid of harmful content. However, some groups in the UK, like in previous examples, have thought that this could mean that the government is almost writing the company's guidelines into law and making it so that certain freedoms of expression that are currently granted in the UK under the actual law would end up becoming banned online, because the terms and conditions of the relevant social media companies state that, and the government is almost backing they're putting their support behind the companies and leaving it to them to decide when something isn't acceptable. However, the government has responded by saying that this law is a means of ensuring social media companies are taking necessary actions to remove harmful and unacceptable content that is on their site. So very terrible things which we don't want on the internet, and that it is due to the oversight from that state-backed regulator that it is not entirely giving these powers to the sites. There's still something above them that is keeping an eye and telling them, all right, you need to do this, you need to do that. It's not just up to you. Now, like the issue I explored in Russia, this represents an example of something that you could potentially limit free speech on social media, yet it does aim to eliminate harmful content. So it does have a good aim in the end of the day, at the end of the day. So, but the question still remains of how can we keep social media safe and uphold the freedom of expression? And when does content cross the line from something that is just, let's say, quite uh, maybe some people might deem it as offensive, it might be political, and when does that cross the line into something that should be taken down so that no one can see it? So our final case study here is in India. Once again, Twitter's made an appearance. In India, following clashes with police by farmers on the same day as a military parade, the government ordered Twitter to block hundreds of accounts. Now, Twitter initially complied, but then reinstated some accounts after an outcry from freedom of speech activists. This put Twitter in a difficult position where it either upheld the law in India or defended its actions in terms of free speech. And this is a bigger sort of problem around the world that social media companies have, where it's an issue of priorities. Do they want to comply with the country's laws all the time, even if they may seem as if they are encroaching on the freedom of speech? Or do they want to fight for freedom of expression? Now, the matter is inherently complex. For example, in this case, Twitter decided to reinstate accounts that considered themselves news or media outlets or journalists and activists. Yet, none of these words are particularly defined. Why can't I just go in and make an account and say I'm a journalist and then, put sort of content that they wouldn't accept normally under there and that the government might want to take down, but Twitter has defended me because I've named myself as a journalist. Now, this debate returns to that of who holds the deciding vote when accounts or posts should be removed. And maybe it suggests that there might need to be an international organization, sort of a one that's detached from the situation, maybe like the UN. I'm not saying sort of that big, but set up to oversee these issues and respond to them in a fair and unbiased manner. So, but would this be viable? Would it be viable to create a sort of global organization that oversees all of these issues? Because I only think that they're going to get bigger from now. So, in conclusion, I think it is fair to say that social media is now such a big part of human existence that it is impossible to ignore the implications raised through its power that companies wield and how they use it. Therefore, in the coming years and decades, I believe we only see an increase in situations where social media and free speech are involved, as I said. But I do not want to tell people what the right way forward should be, but rather remind everyone that it is our generation who will one day be making the decisions on these important matters that will be part of governments across the planet, be part of big tech companies, and we will have the chance to make these decisions for ourselves. Thus, it is forums like these, which we're in right now, where we can debate these issues internationally, that I think are so important, and that is hopefully one of the many reasons why you're all here right now. So I just wanted to end by saying that I hope that the questions I've raised during this presentation have stimulated some interest. Maybe people have ideas ready to debate. And once again, thank you for listening. And that's it. That's it all.
So now we're going to talk about minority groups and freedom of speech by Ariana.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Ariana. I am a grade 11 student from Canada. And as you can see, I'm doing a presentation on the freedom of speech and minorities. So just a quick disclaimer before I start, I am in no way an expert on this subject. So please do take all of my words and everything in this presentation with a grain of salt. If you disagree with one of my opinions, that is completely fine. I understand. However, please remember that this forum is meant to be a safe space for everyone. So please remain respectful of everyone here. And just don't be rude. Okay. So I'm just going to start with some basic definitions of like 2 words, I think. So basically a minority, some of you guys probably know this, but just make sure it's just a culturally, ethnically, or racially distinct group that coexists with, but is subordinate to a more dominant group. it doesn't necessarily correlate to population, and subordinacy is the chief defining characteristic of a minority. And this is relative to an area. So in Canada, Black, Indigenous people of color are minorities, but in like China, Christians are minorities, right? So obviously everywhere in the world, there's different minorities in every country. So activism is just taking action to promote social or political change. It's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It just depends on what the activist is supporting. Activism just encourages different perspectives in governance and has brought about substantial change in society. So just like how freedom of speech can benefit minorities. So as some of you probably have realized also, in essence, freedom of speech can just help us or like minorities stand up for their rights. And in the past, with activism for minorities, that has been a valuable fundamental right that has aided in the process of revolutions and social movements. Though it also technically, in theory, protects minorities from hate speech and can also reduce bigots in theory. However, this isn't always the case, as we are seeing right now. Freedom of speech also allows us to critique those in power without fear of consequences, and it allows more voice in governance, and it allows us to facilitate a free exchange of ideas. So freedom of speech and expression and minorities around the world. So in Russia, I know that there are some laws, or not laws, but there are definitely laws against hate speech. However, this doesn't always apply to some minorities. So I know that in some regions in Russia, they have enacted laws that restrict the distribution of materials promoting queer relationships to minors. This is a direct violation of the freedom of expression of the queer community. However, there was a bill that was proposed that wanted to punish people that publicly express their homosexuality with fines, but it was rejected. So it is like one small step in the right direction. Sorry. So in China, if some of you are very active on the internet, I'm sure you guys know of the Archive of Our Own situation. So basically, it's just one website where a lot of people publish their works. However, on it, there's a lot of queer content, there's a lot of sexually explicit content. And in China, it was censored and it was blocked by the big firewall. So again, this is a direct like control. This is like the government trying to control the production of queer content in the country, which is again a limitation of freedom of expression and speech. There are also no or to little effective laws against hate speech in China, and freedom of speech of religious minorities is very limited. So in Iran, their speech and expression is also very limited. So compulsory veils for women, and there is no LGBTQ plus tolerance. So basically, to my knowledge, you can be executed if you are in a same-sex relationship. There are also little to no hate speech laws in place here, and it restricts the freedom of speech, expression, and press. Okay, so in free speech in like so-called Western and progressive countries. So like I would be talking about like Britain, Canada, USA, such and such. So there's a thing that you guys might have heard of. It's called the free speech crisis. And it's basically when some people think that their free speech is under attack. And this is usually left-wing against right-wing politics. However, the free speech crisis silences minorities, and it actually creates a more narrative in media. So basically, the purpose of this free speech myth is to be able to speak without punishment. So it's not really about having freedom of speech, but rather freedom from the consequences of your speech and expression. So this is based off of two ideals: that all speech should be free, and that all freedom of speech means freedom from objection. And both of these components aren't exactly true. So I'm just going to like quickly talk about like a position against the free speech crisis. And hopefully it allows you to get a more fuller picture of like what it is and why some people would be for and against it. So for against the free speech crisis, so while speech is allowed, deliberate incitement of hatred or advocacy of violence towards certain groups is not. So some of the people who advocate for free speech have to somehow think that free speech has become that they are allowed to say stuff and that other people aren't allowed to get mad at them, instead of that they are allowed to say stuff and that other people are allowed to object and have meaningful discourse. Free speech has also become something that allows a propagation of hatred and false ideas. This is not what free speech is at the foundations, right? Because free speech is supposed to be for facilitating discussion and discourse and being able to object to other people's ideas so as to be able to talk about it and debate like what we're doing in this forum, right? So this so-called free speech crisis is centered around privileging freedom of speech and expression over the right to exist and the freedom to live most of the time for minorities. So while some free speech advocates, or especially free advocates for about the free speech crisis in Western countries, they don't usually care about free speech itself. They care about being able to defame and spew libel against others, which is usually minorities without legal consequences. However, that also brings us back to the question of how much speech should be allowed. So what is considered hate speech and what isn't considered hate speech, right? So again, that's a debate that we've been having for a really long time, and we can continue to have that. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of get into how, even though we do have freedom of speech, is it really useful for minorities? So on the side, it's a quote about the model minority. So hopefully, I think some of you guys may have heard of the model minority, but basically it is a myth that encourages many minorities, usually Asian minorities, to stay silent even in the face of injustice. And this is a really big part of why many minorities don't speak about like the injustice that they face. So other reasons include fear of the attitude of the people around them. It includes the thought that no one would listen, and of course, a systemic oppression that minorities do face from the government, right? And I can't speak for everyone else, but I was taught when I was younger by my parents that even if I did face injustice, I should stay silent because I was taught that it wouldn't work and that it would only make situations worse. And in many cases, this is true. As you guys may know, right now there is the huge outpouring of women who are talking about sexual assault and how they have faced it in the past. And there are so many people right now who are like, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. There are a lot of people who are just disregarding these women's like lived experiences and just completely choosing to ignore their experiences and their coming forward for sexual assault. So as you can see from this example, sometimes it is true, even if we do come forward about our experiences and what we have faced in the past, like no one really listens sometimes. This is also the case for many Indigenous women in Canada as they are being murdered. But like before, I think like maybe last year, all of their efforts weren't listened to and no one really paid attention until the government ruled it. So how can we help minorities speak up? How do we help minorities get justice? So we have to listen and educate ourselves. So it's a really good idea to reevaluate yourself and any implicit biases that you may have against groups of minorities. So even if you are part of a minority yourself, it's a good idea to I guess, think about your views and how you may be holding some internalized prejudice or just prejudice against other groups of minorities. Another way to help minorities is to speak alongside minorities, take advantage of your freedom of speech, and just like help amplify minority voices. However, it is important not to speak over them or talk for them, but to put their voices first and just help them talk about their injustices and how they think that other people can help. Okay, so that's it. Thank you guys for listening. If you have any questions, you can like contact me somewhere if you want. But yeah, that's basically it.
Yeah, thank you, Ariana. Our third section of speakers, which is limits and control freedom of speech. And this is kind of just like overall in general, like freedom of speech and how like we limit freedom and control freedom of speech and if we should.
So we are going to talk about freedom of speech. Yeah. Okay. To begin, all of us have ever heard people who claim we live in a free country, we're allowed to express our opinions freely. but everyone around constantly gets punished for their words. However, does freedom of speech truly mean just the right to say offensive things without being punished? Okay, let's talk about what is freedom of speech, like generally. Freedom of speech is the concept of the inborn human rights to express one's opinion publicly without fear of censorship or punishment. Speech does not relate to public speaking only, it also includes other forms of expression. The phrase freedom of expression itself usually used synonymously, but from the legal point of view, it includes any activity of seeking, receiving, and imparting information or ideas. Um, as for universal laws, there is an article number 19, as you can see, of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's mentioned there that everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference, and everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of his choice. So the next thing I want to mention is about freedom of speech in different countries. Now you can see a table showing the percentage of various directions in the area of freedom of expression in some countries. So you guys may take a look at it. The report made by local risk analysis company Verisk Maplecroft found that about 3.38 billion people, or really 46% of the global population, live in countries deemed to be at extreme risk in relation to the right privacy and freedom of expression. There were like nearly 58 countries categorized as extreme risk when it came to citizens' right to privacy. So next is Julia.
Okay, yeah, so I'm gonna talk about some limits to free speech. So, of course, you are free to say whatever you think, but there are some limits to that. The first one is obscenity, and some people may think that obscenity is maybe some kind of vulgar words, but it's not that. They're not punished. Obscenity counts. In obscenity, you can include, for example, child pornography or something like this. So the next one is fighting words or threats. So fighting words is an insult that may provoke a physical fight, and they will be punished. And there is no exception for hate speech. So if you make any racist threats, they are unprotected, and you're also gonna get punished. And of course, personalized threats of illegal conduct, for example, death threats, are also legal. The next one is going against corporate policies. I'm going to give an example. Students in school are not allowed to print articles in the school newspaper over the objections of the school administration. The next one is commercial advertising. So speech advertising a product is constitutionally protected, but not as much as other speech. For example, government may ban a misleading commercial, but it can't ban some political speech which can also be misleading. And the last one is time, place, and manner limits. These limits can apply to any speech, so the topic really doesn't matter. I'm also going to give an example. So there is a demonstration at night, really noisy, in front of some politician's house. and it is going against rights of politicians' neighbors for quite evening. So this demonstration will be prohibited, but it could be the identical activity can be permitted, for example, if it's happening in different time during day or in different place, for example, near this politician's workplace, or in different manner, for example, silent protest. So the next thing I want to talk about is the hybrid nature of speech debate. So the speech is a hybrid both of thought and action. Thought is inward and silent, so as long as it remains that way, it has minimal effects on the world. But speech is an expression of the thought, so through any forms of communication, so it can affect people around you. And the norms that are governing these two elements are different because thought is unrestrained, and because of the belief that the proper end of the thought is truth, and freedom of speech allows us to seek for this truth. And but speech as an action is quite different because, for example, if you yell fire in the theater, it may cause some problems. For example, someone will get hurt. So action, and specifically harmful action, should be restricted and controlled. And here's the problem, because from one point of view, we shouldn't have restrict the freedom of speech as a thought, but on the other hand, we have to because it's an action. And there are two main positions. Some people entirely equivalent speech to the thought, so it should has complete freedom. But in this case, we dismiss the component of speech that is correctly understood as an action. On the other hand, some people think that speech should be treated wholly like an action. And in these cases, freedom of speech is not recognized or accepted. And unfortunately, recent examples include that totalitarian and authoritarian regimes where speech can threaten the rulers and their position is considered to be a harmful act and should be suppressed.
So we talk about violations of freedom of speech. We can't forget about China. China's regime has become more and more repressive in recent years. Previously relatively free internet space had been replaced by the Great Firewall of China, which is the largest censorship operation in the world. Its role in internet censorship in China is to block access to selected foreign websites such as Facebook, Google Search, Twitter, Wikipedia, etc. It also slows down cross-border internet traffic. Since the outbreak of COVID-19, hundreds of people, including doctors, journalists, and lawyers, have been arrested in China for merely speaking out about the virus, according to reports from human rights activists. The human rights movement in China is growing, but those who attempt to report on violations face serious risks of abuse. The authorities invent pretexts to silence and even imprison peaceful activists. Turkey. While Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has a lot of power in Turkish politics, opposition victories in 2019, municipal elections, and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the already shaky economy have given the government new incentives to suppress and limit public discourse. When it comes to social media censorship, Turkey is one of the world leaders. That means access to the likes of Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Wikipedia, etc. has been previously blocked inside the country. As a result, the country is now classed by the Freedom Index as not free. Belarus. Since the presidential elections in Belarus in August 2020, hundreds of thousands of people have taken to street to oppose Alexander Lukashenko's regime. According to official figures, the long-standing president won the election with a vote share of 80%, but widespread reports of electoral fraud and large-scale mobilization against the results speak to a different reality. The protesters have faced violence from authorities. At the end of 2020, the Basna Human Rights Center documented more than 1,000 testimonies of torture victims. Russia. In 2020, the State Duma passed a bill that would allow the federal media watchdog to block websites, including social media sites, if they are found to restrict important information on Russian territory or contradict state media coverage of foreign sanctions against Russia or its citizens. Most recently, the State Duma of Russia adopted a law on the so-called educational activities. The author of the bill argues that it is directed against propaganda activities of anti-Russian forces in the school and student environment. After the implementation of this law, organizations that have not received official approval from the authorities won't be able to engage in educational activities. Scientists and educators fear that their work is being censored and banned. In conclusion, we should say that without any doubt, freedom of speech is an essential thing in every progressive country. People should have the right to express themselves and their opinions. It's the most important thing to remember is that your freedom should make positive change, help to create a better world for other people, not make it worse. Not everyone understands that simple idea, and because of that, freedom of speech has its own limits. In an ideal world, they should be used to protect other people, not to oppress them. Thank you.